There are some secrets kept out of love that become unbearable, some truths that need to be spoken, even when speaking them feels like betrayal, some moments when loyalty to the people who raised you collides with the pull toward the people who gave you life, and you realize you can honor both without choosing between them. What happened when 32-year-old Daniel Park walked onto the Family Feud stage with his adoptive parents Richard and Susan Park and his two adoptive siblings, looking nervous in a way that went beyond normal stage fright, was the carefully planned revelation of something his adoptive parents didn't know. That 6 months earlier, Daniel's biological mother had found him after searching for 32 years, that they'd been building a relationship in secret, because Daniel was terrified of hurting the parents who'd raised him, and that his biological mother, his biological sister, and his biological grandmother were sitting in the Family Feud audience watching him, waiting for the moment Daniel had promised them he'd finally tell his adoptive parents the truth, that he'd found his birth family and wanted them all to be part of his life. He stood there trying to hold it together, trying to find the courage to speak words that felt like they might shatter the only family he'd ever known, not realizing that when Steve Harvey asked about his background and Daniel finally said, "I need to tell my parents something I should have told them 6 months ago," the show would halt completely because some revelations are too big to rush past. If you've ever been adopted and felt torn between two families, if you've ever kept a secret to protect someone's feelings and watched it grow into something that hurt worse than truth would have, if you've ever loved multiple families and feared that loving one meant betraying the other, you need to hear what happened when Daniel stopped hiding. Before we begin, if you believe that adoption is complex and that loving your birth family doesn't diminish your love for your adoptive family, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel because we share stories about people navigating impossible situations with as much grace as they can manage. Daniel Park was born Daniel Martinez in 1992 in Los Angeles to a 15-year-old mother named Maria Martinez who'd gotten pregnant by a 17-year-old boyfriend who disappeared the moment he learned about the pregnancy. Maria was a sophomore in high school, the daughter of a single mother who cleaned houses to support them, and when Maria got pregnant she faced an impossible choice: try to raise a baby at 15 with no support and no resources, or place the baby for adoption. Maria's mother, Rosa, pushed hard for adoption, said Maria was too young, that keeping the baby would ruin her life, that adoption would give the baby opportunities Maria couldn't provide. Maria spent her entire pregnancy torn, but when Daniel was born in February 1992, Maria held him for 2 days, memorized his face, and made the hardest decision of her life. She placed him for adoption, choosing a family through an adoption agency. Richard and Susan Park, a Korean-American couple in their 30s who desperately wanted children but couldn't conceive biologically. The adoption was supposed to be closed, meaning no contact between Maria and the adoptive family, but Maria asked for one thing: yearly photos and brief updates about how Daniel was doing, sent through the agency. The Parks agreed to this, though they were nervous about any birth-parent contact. Maria signed away her parental rights 3 days after Daniel's birth, left the hospital without him, and spent the next week sobbing so hard she couldn't function. She was 15 years old and had just given away her baby, and the grief was incomprehensible. But she also believed she'd done the right thing, that Daniel would have opportunities with the Parks that she couldn't give him, that this was love even though it felt like dying. Daniel grew up as Daniel Park, the adopted son of Richard and Susan, who told him from the earliest age that he was adopted, that his birth mother had loved him but couldn't care for him, that adoption was beautiful and special. Daniel knew he looked different from his Korean adoptive parents. He was Latino, with dark hair and brown skin, but to him the Parks were his family, his only family, the people who'd raised him from infancy. He had 2 adoptive siblings, both also adopted from different backgrounds, and the Park family celebrated diversity and openness about adoption. Daniel had a good childhood, stable and loving, and while he was curious about his birth family, he didn't feel a burning need to search for them. His parents were his parents. That was enough. Maria, meanwhile, struggled with the loss of Daniel for years. She finished high school, went to community college, became a nurse, got married at 25 to a man named Carlos Rodriguez, had 2 more children, a daughter Elena in 2000 and a son Lucas in 2003. She built a good life, but there was always a hole where Daniel should have been, always grief about the son she'd given away. The yearly photos and updates the parks sent through the agency sustained her, let her watch Daniel grow up from a distance, baby photos, first day of kindergarten, soccer team pictures, high school graduation. She kept every single photo in a special album, showed her mother Rosa, but never told her husband Carlos or her children that they had an older half-brother who'd been adopted before they were born. The secret felt too complicated to explain, too painful to speak out loud. When Daniel turned 18 in 2010, the adoption agency contacted Maria and informed her that California law now allowed adult adoptees to access their original birth certificates and that if Daniel wanted to search for her, he could. Maria's heart surged with hope. Maybe he'd search, maybe she'd get to meet him, maybe the 17 years of wondering could end. But Daniel didn't search. He just started college, was focused on his future, and while he was still curious about his birth family, actively searching felt like betraying the parents who'd raised him. Years passed. Daniel graduated college in 2014, got a job in marketing, got married to a woman named Amy in 2018, started building his own adult life. He still didn't search for his birth family, though he thought about it sometimes, especially when he and Amy started discussing having children and Daniel realized he knew nothing about his medical history or genetic background. In 2023, when Daniel was 31, California changed its adoption laws to make it easier for birth parents to find adoptees, creating a mutual consent registry. Maria, who'd been waiting 22 years for some way to find Daniel, registered immediately, hoping desperately that Daniel had registered too. He hadn't, but the registry allowed Maria to hire a search angel, someone who helps birth parents find adoptees. And through public records and DNA testing databases, Maria found him. In March 2024, Maria sent Daniel a letter through the registry system. Dear Daniel, I'm your biological mother. I placed you for adoption when I was 15 years old, and not a day has passed that I haven't thought about you. If you're willing, I'd like to meet you. If not, I understand. But please know that you were loved, you were wanted, and giving you up was the hardest thing I've ever done. Daniel received the letter and was shocked. For 31 years his birth mother had been an abstract concept, a teenage girl who'd made a difficult choice, not a real person with a name and a life and a desire to know him. His first instinct was fear. Fear of what this would mean for his relationship with his adoptive parents. Fear of opening a door he couldn't close. Fear of hurting the people who'd raised him. But he was also curious, wanted to know where he came from, wanted to meet the woman who'd given birth to him. He wrote back, cautiously, I received your letter. I'd be open to meeting you, but I need time to process this. Can we start slowly? Over the following months, Daniel and Maria exchanged emails, then phone calls, carefully building a relationship. Maria told Daniel about his biological father who she'd long since lost contact with, about his medical history, about her life now, that he had 2 half-siblings, Elena, 24, and Lucas, 21, who didn't know he existed yet, and a grandmother, Rosa, who'd helped raise them. By July 2024, Daniel had been talking to Maria for 4 months and still hadn't told his adoptive parents. Every time he tried to bring it up, fear stopped him. How could he tell Richard and Susan that he'd found his birth mother without it feeling like he was choosing Maria over them? How could he explain that wanting to know Maria didn't diminish his love for them? He was paralyzed by the fear of hurting the people who'd given him everything. Maria, understanding Daniel's conflict, was patient but also sad. She'd found her son after 32 years but couldn't fully have a relationship with him because he was hiding her from his adoptive family. She wanted to meet Daniel in person, wanted to introduce him to Elena and Lucas and Rosa, wanted to finally have her son in her life in some meaningful way, but she also understood his position, didn't want to push him into something he wasn't ready for. In August 2024, Daniel's adoptive sister Rachel suggested their family apply to be on Family Feud as a fun activity, something to do together. The family applied and was selected to tape in October 2024. When Daniel got the news, An idea formed that was either brilliant or terrible. He couldn't decide which. What if he invited Maria to be in the audience, and what if he used the platform of national television to finally tell his adoptive parents the truth? It would be terrifying, potentially disastrous, but it would force the conversation Daniel had been avoiding for 6 months. He called Maria and explained his plan. Maria was hesitant. This seemed like something Daniel should tell his parents privately, not on television. But Daniel explained that he'd been trying to find the courage for months and kept failing, that maybe having witnesses and cameras would force him to actually do it. Maria agreed to come to Los Angeles with Alinas, who by now knew about Daniel, with Rosa, and they'd sit in the audience, and Daniel would find a way during the show to reveal the truth. On October 25, 2024, Daniel arrived at the Family Feud studio with his adoptive family, Richard and Susan Park, and his adoptive siblings Rachel and James. They were excited, nervous, completely unaware that Daniel's biological mother and biological sister and biological grandmother were sitting in the audience watching. Daniel could barely function, kept scanning the audience until he spotted them. Maria, Elena, and Rosa, sitting in the third row, all of them crying just from seeing him. Maria was seeing her son in person for the first time since he was 2 days old. 2 years of wondering condensed into this moment of watching him walk onto a stage, alive and healthy and grown, and she couldn't stop crying. The show started, Steve Harvey came out, began his usual routine of greeting the families. When he got to Daniel, he noticed this guy looked intensely nervous, more than normal stage fright. "You okay, man? You look like you're about to pass out." Daniel tried to laugh it off. "Just nervous." But Steve, who'd been doing this long enough to read people, pressed gently. "It's more than that. What's going on?" And Daniel, who'd planned to wait until later in the show but couldn't carry it anymore, said the words he'd been terrified to speak for 6 months. "Steve, I need to tell my parents something. Something I should have told them 6 months ago, but I've been too scared." Susan Park's face immediately showed concern. "Daniel, what's wrong?" Daniel looked at his adoptive parents, the people who'd raised him, who'd loved him unconditionally, who deserved honesty from him. "6 months ago, I got a letter from my biological mother. She found me through the California Adoption Registry. And I wrote back. I've been talking to her for 6 months. We've been emailing and calling and building a relationship. And I didn't tell you because I was scared you'd think I was betraying you, or that I didn't appreciate everything you've done for me, or that I was choosing her over you. But I'm not choosing anyone. I love you. You're my parents, you raised me, you're my family. But I also wanted to know where I came from, wanted to meet the woman who gave birth to me. And she's here, right now, in the audience with my biological sister and my biological grandmother. They're watching us." The silence that followed was crushing. Steve Harvey stood frozen, his mouth open, unable to process what was happening. Susan Park's hand went to her chest, her face cycling through shock, hurt, and confusion. Richard Park looked at Daniel like he was seeing him for the first time. Rachel and James were staring at their brother in disbelief, and in the audience, Maria was sobbing, Elena holding her mother, both of them overwhelmed by this public moment they'd never anticipated. Steve Harvey did something unprecedented. He made the timeout signal with his hands and said loudly, "We need to stop. Stop the show right now. This is not something we can just keep playing through." He turned to Daniel, his voice gentle despite the shock. "Daniel, you just told your adoptive parents, on national television, that you've been in contact with your biological mother for 6 months without telling them, and that she's here in the audience. Is that correct?" Daniel nodded, crying now. "Yes. And I know I should have told them privately. I know doing this on TV is probably wrong, but I kept trying to find the courage and I couldn't, and I thought maybe if I did it here, with witnesses, I'd finally have to actually say it." Steve looked at Richard and Susan Park, whose faces showed they were processing something enormous. "Mr. and Mrs. Park, did you have any idea Daniel had found his birth mother?" Susan shook her head, her voice breaking. "No, we had no idea. We didn't even know he was searching." Richard added, "We've always told Daniel he could search if he wanted to. We've always said we supported that. But to find out he's been hiding this for 6 months, that he didn't trust us enough to tell us." He couldn't finish, too hurt to continue. Daniel stepped toward his parents, desperate. "It wasn't about trust. It was about fear. I was scared that if I told you I'd found her, you'd think I didn't love you anymore, or that you weren't enough for me. But that's not true. You are enough. You've always been enough. You're my parents. You raised me, you loved me, you made me who I am. But I also wanted to know Maria. I wanted to know my medical history, my ethnic background, where I came from. And those two things, loving you and wanting to know her, they don't cancel each other out." Steve turned to the audience, looking for Maria, as the birth mother here. "Can she stand up?" Maria stood slowly, her face wet with tears, her daughter Alina standing with her for support. Steve beckoned her forward. "Come up here. If we're doing this, we're doing it all the way." Maria walked to the stage, moving toward the son she'd given away 32 years ago, the son she'd held for 2 days, and then never seen again until today. She stopped a few feet from Daniel, both of them crying, and Maria spoke first. "Daniel, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. I shouldn't have agreed to do this on television. This should have been private between you and your parents." But Daniel shook his head. "No, this was my choice, and I'm glad you're here." Steve looked at Susan and Richard Park. "Mr. and Mrs. Park, I need to ask you something. When you adopted Daniel, you agreed to send yearly photos to his birth mother through the agency. You knew she wanted to stay connected in some way. So you understood that she loved him, that she cared about what happened to him." Susan nodded, wiping her eyes. "Yes, we knew she loved him. That's why she placed him for adoption, because she loved him and wanted better for him than she could provide at 15. Steve continued, "So knowing that she loved him, knowing that she's spent 32 years wondering about him, can you understand why Daniel might want to meet her? Why he might want to know where he came from?" Richard spoke, his voice tight with emotion. "Of course we understand that. We've always told Daniel he could search if he wanted to. What hurts is that he hid it from us, that he's been having this relationship with his birth family for 6 months and didn't tell us. That makes us feel like we failed somehow, like we didn't create an environment where he felt safe telling us." Daniel's voice broke completely. "You didn't fail. You've been perfect parents. The failure is mine. I was too scared to tell you because I didn't want to hurt you, but in trying to protect you, I hurt you worse. I'm so sorry." Susan Park looked at Maria, really looked at her for the first time. "You're Maria? You're Daniel's birth mother?" Maria nodded. "Yes. I'm so sorry for how this happened. I never wanted to cause problems for your family. Daniel is your son. You raised him. I'm the person who gave birth to him and loved him enough to let you raise him." Susan's face showed she was struggling with complex emotions, but when she spoke, her voice was clear. "Thank you for that. Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for giving us Daniel, for trusting us to raise him." She turned to Daniel. "And Daniel, I wish you'd told us. I wish we'd had 6 months to process this together instead of finding out on national television. But I understand why you were scared. And I want you to know that we're not threatened by you knowing your birth family. We're secure enough in our relationship with you to understand that loving them doesn't diminish your love for us." Richard added, "You're allowed to have a relationship with your birth family. Daniel, you're allowed to want to know where you came from. That's normal and healthy. We just want to be included in your life. All parts of your life, including this." Steve Harvey, who'd been watching this unfold with tears running down his face, spoke to the whole group. "What we're witnessing here is adoption at its most complex and most beautiful. Daniel loves 2 families, the family that gave him life and the family that raised him. And he thought he had to choose, thought loving one meant betraying the other. But what we're learning is that love multiplies, it doesn't divide. Daniel having a relationship with Maria doesn't take anything away from Richard and Susan. If anything, it adds to Daniel's life, gives him more family, more connection, more understanding of who he is." He turned to Maria. "And Maria, you gave your baby to this family 32 years ago because you loved him. And they've raised him beautifully, given him everything you hoped they would. You made the right choice, even though it cost you everything. And now you get to know him as an adult, get to see the man he's become, and you can be part of his life in a new way without taking him away from the people who raised him." Maria nodded, crying, "I don't want to take him away. I just want to know him. I want him to know his siblings and his grandmother. I want to be part of his life in whatever way works for everyone." Susan Park made a decision then that showed extraordinary grace. She walked over to Maria and did something nobody expected. She hugged her. "Thank you for our son. Thank you for choosing us. And if you want to be part of Daniel's life, then you're part of our extended family too. We don't have to compete. We can all love him together." The moment Susan hugged Maria, both women sobbing in each other's arms, the entire studio erupted in tears. Steve Harvey sat down on the stage floor, overwhelmed. Elena, Daniel's biological sister, was invited up, and Daniel met his sister for the first time, hugged her, learned that he had a younger brother too who couldn't be there today. Rosa, his biological grandmother, came up and held Daniel's face in her hands, told him she'd prayed for this moment for 32 years. The show had completely stopped, forgotten, because everyone understood this was more important than any game. Over the next hour, with taping suspended indefinitely, the two families, Daniel's adoptive family and his biological family, sat together and talked. They shared stories, looked at photos, began the process of integrating these two parts of Daniel's life that he'd been keeping separate. The Parks learned about Maria's life, about Alina and Lucas, about the family that had created Daniel genetically. Maria and Rosa learned about Daniel's childhood, about the parents who'd loved him and raised him well, about the siblings he'd grown up with. It wasn't simple or easy. There were moments of discomfort, moments of pain, moments of navigating complex feelings. But there was also grace, compassion, and a shared commitment to Daniel's well-being that transcended biological versus adoptive distinctions. The episode never aired as a normal game show episode. Instead, Family Feud created a documentary-style special about Daniel's reunion and the complex emotions of adoption, with all parties' permission. It aired 2 months later and was viewed over 600 million times, sparking massive conversations about open adoption, about adult adoptees' rights to know their biological families, about how adoptive parents can support their children's searches without feeling threatened. The response was overwhelming, with thousands of adoptees sharing their own stories of navigating relationships with both families, of the guilt and fear that comes with wanting to know your biological family while loving your adoptive family. 6 months after the Family Feud taping, Daniel's two families celebrated Thanksgiving together. Richard and Susan Park, Rachel and James, Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, Elena and Lucas, and Rosa all gathering at Daniel and Amy's house. It was complex and sometimes awkward, but it was also beautiful in its way. All these people who loved Daniel coming together to be family in a new configuration that honored both his origins and his upbringing. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that adoption is complex and that loving multiple families isn't betrayal but expansion, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe to our channel because we share stories about people navigating impossible situations with love and grace, about families that don't fit traditional molds but work anyway, about truth that's terrifying to speak but ultimately healing. Daniel Park stood on a Family Feud stage and revealed to his adoptive parents that he'd been in secret contact with his biological mother for 6 months, that she was in the audience watching, that he'd been too scared to tell them because he thought loving her meant not loving them. When the show halted because some revelations are too big for entertainment, when his adoptive mother hugged his biological mother and said they could all love Daniel together, when two families who'd been kept separate merged in the most unlikely place, we all learned that family isn't zero-sum, that love multiplies rather than divides, and that the most generous thing adoptive parents can do is recognize that their children's search for biological family isn't rejection, but a healthy human need to understand origins. That's why Family Feud stopped, why everyone cried, why this moment of truth became something sacred. Because Daniel stopped hiding, both his families chose grace over competition, and love won in all its complicated, messy, beautiful forms.